Welcome everyone to the Field Center's second spring symposium, Voting Access and Preparation for Youth in Foster Care, Strategies for Supporting Civic Engagement. And that is as I mentioned, we are so happy to have all of you joining us today and to hear from our distinguished and diverse panelists about this incredibly important issue. My name is Kara Fink, and I have the pleasure of serving as a co-faculty director of the of the Field Center for Children's Policy Practice and Research here at University of Pennsylvania, which, as many of you hopefully know, is an interdisciplinary academic center dedicated to improving child welfare and outcomes for children and family involved in the system. This is, as I mentioned, our second spring symposium. For those of you who were not able to join us for our first spring symposium, which dealt with representation of parents and a holistic model to help improve outcomes for children in foster care, we would encourage you to reach out to our website, and the video recording is up there and the links are all available, and encourage you to see that as well if you're interested. I want to thank the Field Center for their support. I want to thank Penn Law Conferences Events for their support of this webinar today, which is so very timely and really, I think, an urgent need that the child welfare community has for too long not really focused on. And so I really want to thank all of the panelists who are joining us today, whose work has been dedicated to increasing voter participation and civic engagement among our foster youth population. A couple of logistics that I wanted to make sure all of our audience members know. If you would like to submit a question for the Q&A section of the webinar towards the end, you can submit a question by using the feature found on the ribbon at the bottom of your window. As always, please keep your questions topical and appropriate. Anyone posting inappropriate language or content will be removed from the webinar. Also, as a note, we are recording this virtual symposium, and we will have a recording of the symposium available on the Field Center's website after this is over. Again, the importance of this panel cannot be understated, especially in light of recent national events and what we see happening in some states, including Georgia, to restrict the civic participation and engagement of voters, particularly voters of color. And so I am just thrilled to introduce Sarah Wash, who has been spearheading the Field Center's work in this area and brought this issue to our attention today to introduce all of the panelists. Sarah is the program manager for the Field Center. And I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Thank you, Kara. So hopefully everyone can see me on the screen. It's great to be here presenting on this panel. I'm also thrilled to see national representation in the audience. We have folks attending this webinar from all over the country, which is really heartening to me to see that this is a national issue that, you know, no matter where you live, it's something that you can and should care about. Voting rights, voter access, especially for a marginalized population such as youth in foster care. For those of us joining from our home state of Pennsylvania, we have a primary election coming up next month. So this is incredibly timely, and we urge all of you to take some of the lessons learned today and implement it into practice over the next month so that young people in Pennsylvania will be eligible to vote in the primary in May. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of this topic before we introduce our fantastic presenters. So let me go ahead and share my screen and bring up some slides. So hopefully one of my co-panelists will let me know if something is not working, but at this point, we should be able to move right into a presentation. So during the 2020 presidential election, we actually realized that there was very limited information on the voting habits of young adults who are or were in foster care. And so we hypothesized that even if these young people wanted to vote, that they might experience additional barriers, such as receiving assistance in registering to vote, physically getting to the polls, you know, because youth in foster care may have more than one placement, more than one place that they've lived in during the course of a year. And so access to voting was going to be a challenge. Civic engagement has an important impact for all of us, but especially for youth with experience in foster care. It is critical to elect officials who take seriously the challenges that their constituents are facing in terms of things like housing, healthcare, employment, education, and many more issues affecting young adults as they transition out of foster care. So we started to do a little bit of digging at the Field Center to see what we already knew about the topic of foster youth and voting. Okay, so in 2017, we learned that California already passed a law mandating that youth in foster care are provided with voter registration resources and paperwork when they progress into adulthood. So that's just a snapshot of a newspaper article from when the bill passed. And the article indicated that although there were 60,000 youth in foster care in California when the legislation passed, this bill would impact 10 to 15,000 of them. And voter registration would now be added to the list of forms that foster youth must fill out between the ages of 18 and 21. So we don't have any law like that in the state of Pennsylvania. The second snapshot that I have for you is from The Imprint, a leading child welfare news media outlet that published some articles on the civic engagement of young adults with foster care experience. And I'm including this quote from one of their contributing writers because it highlights the hopelessness that she felt as she expressed her needs that seemed like an afterthought. She wrote, "As a former foster youth, I see no party or particular politician who is fully focused on the policies and legislation that will protect and defend the humanity of current and former foster youth. Escapism is a familiar refuge for foster youth, escaping abuse and neglect, escaping strangers and unfamiliar adults, and escaping a system that does more harm than good most of the time." So really thinking about how do we motivate and mobilize young people with foster care experience to want to vote. And finally, some data. Sorry, lost my train of thought, but here we are. The Midwest evaluation of the adult functioning of former foster youth, which is called the Midwest Study, is the largest longitudinal study ever done on young adults leaving the foster care system. This study followed a sample of young people from Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois transitioning out of foster care. And data were collected at 5 different points in these young people's lives. First at age 17 or 18, again at age 19, again at 21, 23 and 24, and a 5th time at age 26. And interestingly enough, questions on voting were added at age 21. And here's what we learned. At age 21, so the first yellow bar, registered to vote, 70% of youth in the study were registered to vote. By age 23 or 24, this went up to 74% and stayed at 74% at age 26. So over 70% of youth who've aged out of foster care are registered to vote. Now, the next line, the reddish color, is who actually voted in the most recent presidential election. And of note, at age 21, they were old enough to do so. So the timing of that presidential election did fit. So at age 21, only 43% of youth who had experienced foster care had voted in the most recent presidential election. By age 23 or 24, 44% had voted. And by age 26, 66% had actually voted in the most recent presidential election. And the third line, the brown line, talks about if they are registered with no political party. So at age 21, 73% of youth did not have a political affiliation. At age 23 or 24, this went down to 58%, but it rose again to 69% by age 26. And finally, the authors of the study actually then compared youth aging out of foster care from the Midwest study to the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, so a comparison group of other young people. Young adults in the Midwest study, or youth who had been in foster care, were less likely to report trusting the government, less likely to register to vote or to actually vote, more likely to be uncertain or ambivalent about their party or political affiliation, but if they were choosing a party, they were more likely to register Democratic. And so this is what we currently know about youth in foster care. Oh, and sorry, I was just checking a note about the slides, but everything looks to be good. This is what we know about youth in foster care. And so although we have limited information about the civic engagement of older youth in foster care and young adults who have exited care, we recognize that increasing access and success can have access and interest can have significant benefits. I'm so excited to introduce our featured speaker, Lexi, who is going to share more about the work she has done in this area. So I think I'm going to read her bio, and then she'll come onto the screen next. I don't know if she can turn it on now. Lexi Gruber is a nationally renowned advocate working to make government more responsive to the needs of the most vulnerable citizens. Lexi currently works as a public service consultant at Accenture. In this role, she works with state and federal government agencies to design new business processes and use technology to improve how they serve constituents. During the Biden-Harris presidential campaign, Lexi served as a DNC presidential fellow and led a coalition mobilizing people impacted by foster care. In 2016, Lexi co-founded Foster Youth for Hillary and moderated the first ever town hall on foster care issues within a presidential campaign. Lexi serves on the advisory board of Children's Rights, a national organization that works to reform the U.S. foster care system. Lexi has testified before the United States Congress and presented at the White House and several congressional briefings. Outside of work, Lexi is a classical pianist and studies art history at the Smithsonian Institute. Lexi, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And just want to first thank you with hosting this really important conversation. As you'll see in my presentation, this issue is near and dear to my heart. And I wanted to just begin with telling you a little bit of a story about how I got into foster care and voting, and a little bit of a story. So the story starts back when I was actually in foster care at a group home. At the time, I was 17, and the group home staff had taken us to a local fair. And at the time, Dan Malloy was running for governor of the state of Connecticut, which is where I was born and raised and currently live. And he was going around and shaking people's hands at the fair. And I went up to him and I shook his hand and I said, "My name is Lexi. I'm currently in foster care and I want to know what you're going to do to reform the system." And his response first was, "No one has ever asked me that question." And the second part of his response was, "Now that you asked me that question, let's have a conversation about what I should do. And I'll tell you about my plan to fix it." And so that was the moment I realized when you ask people running for office that question, they'll have to come up with an answer because they want your vote. Later in my career, Sarah mentioned, went to DC, where I worked both with Congress and members of and the White House in terms of thinking about how do we reform the system, Family First Act. And what I saw on Capitol Hill, which was deeply disappointing to me, was that there were too many members of Congress that we would ask them, "Do you know about the foster care system, or do you have plans?" And they just said no. One of the things I learned is the way that you get things done in politics, and especially in Washington, is not just by hoping that members of Congress do the right thing. There is no lobbying group, no advocacy and organization that thinks that members of Congress are going to just do the right thing. And I think we can all agree they generally don't. They care about their elections, and they care if you can do one of two things. Do you have the money or the people to help them get the votes to be re-elected? And as we're seeing a lot of other movements reaching big transformational change in Washington, it's by making sure that they're starting at the ballot box and getting people elected to office that are ready to prioritize this issue and putting the pressure to say, if you don't have a good plan, I'm not going to vote for you. So as I said, I started my journey by asking the governor, and then I wanted to share this picture, which is me asking then candidate Joe Biden the question. And so that's just something that I've seen every time you ask that question. It's always, no one has ever asked me it before, but because you asked it, here's my plan. And so, in speaking of working with the Biden campaign, as Sarah mentioned, I worked with the Biden-Harris campaign. And what I did was I led a movement to mobilize people impacted by foster care to get involved in the campaign. We held listening sessions with the campaign to hear directly with people that were currently in foster care or who had just aged out, telling them what was their biggest priorities and what they wanted to see the administration do to help them. And then also hosting events with the campaign, reporting out the administration's plan to support them. And one of the biggest questions I got or one of the biggest pushbacks I got in doing this mobilization work is people would always say, foster care is not political. It's the one issue that everyone in the country can agree on. Everything is political. And what it means to be political is politics is who gets what and why. It's those decisions, and it's made by people who are elected. I'll also tell you, as a former foster kid who had to ask, a government agency for permission to cut my hair, there is nothing more political than being the child of the government. So really, when we think about foster care reform, it is a deeply political issue, and it begins at the ballot box because the decision makers in foster care are elected officials. Whether it's the president who determines who's going to run the Children's Bureau, which is the federal oversees the state child welfare systems. It's members of Congress that can vote or introduce key pieces of legislation, determine budgets for HHS. It's the governors that appoint the commissioners for the child welfare agencies. It's local, state, and House members that approve the budgets and have direct oversight over the child welfare agencies. And in some states as well, it's judges. It's those local judges that are seeing the removal cases, holding status hearings with youth about their case. And they have a major, major influence on, perhaps even more so, on the direct trajectory that a foster youth's life will take. And this was actually one of the slides that we used during the previous campaign, but also thinking more granular, how is certain aspects of the child welfare system on the ballot? And in this past election, it was healthcare, right? The Affordable Care Act, which gives healthcare to former foster youth, was really on the ballot. And the Biden presidential campaign had said that they would be willing to look at that Medicaid portability, making sure that no matter what state you lived in, that you'd be able to get healthcare, which currently foster youth can only get it in the state that they aged out of. It was also COVID relief, right? We know that foster youth were one of the populations most directly impacted by COVID. And it was Karen Bass, a major champion for foster youth, who was able to get $400 million passed in direct relief to foster youth. And now foster youth are working directly with the commissioner of the Children's Bureau on deciding where those funding go. And it was also LGBTQ equality. There's a case before the Supreme Court right now in allowing discrimination against LGBTQ people, as well as unmarried people, people who are not Christian, both in the services they provide, youth they serve, foster parents they recruit. This is also a state issue as well. So there are major political issues that you'll see in the newspaper that are directly impacted to youth, either in the system or who have just aged out. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of what we did, getting tactical with it. So the first thing that we did was create a Facebook page that grew over to 3,000 followers of people directly impacted by foster care. And we also developed a Foster the Vote toolkit. You'll see the image on the side. And that was information on how foster care reform was on the ballot, and also information on how to vote. It's just traditional campaign literature, how a candidate might hand you their flyer and say, this is what I'm going to do, and here's how you vote for me. We created a toolkit that directly explained how this election would impact youth in foster care, and also making sure that they knew how to vote. We also then developed a presentation on the election and how to vote, and we presented that to local foster care organizations, including group homes and independent living centers. And then we held 3 town halls explaining how the campaign would help foster youth, and then we held 2 listening sessions with the campaign, and then we also held subsequent listening sessions with the transition team. And as we were doing outreach and sharing the toolkit or wanting to do presentations, we heard from a lot of organizations that were worried that distributing the literature or being involved in any way or referring young people, sharing the invite to an event would break that 501c3 rules. But contrary to popular belief, 501c3s can engage in elections as long as they do not take a partisan stance. You're allowed to share information about candidates as long as you're not endorsing it, and certainly sharing that information does not violate those rules. I'm happy if anyone has any more questions about resources to learn more on that. That I know is a big barrier, but it really is a belief that's not backed by the existing rules around that. And so if you're interested in helping young people that you work with or really sharing, making sure that people who are running for office are explaining how they're going to reform the system, is one, individually, you can ask candidates as a constituent and as a voter how they're going to support youth in foster care. Candidates do have town halls, all of them, even on the local level, all of them are on Zoom. Also, I found that tweeting or just commenting on Facebook, people are responsive to that. And you can also just write an op-ed in your local newspaper saying, I know there's elections coming up. I care deeply about the child welfare system. And none of the candidates have a plan yet, which after you explain how broken the system is, people will be surprised to hear that no one running for office has a plan to address it, which then puts pressure directly on them to put out that plan. And two, you can ask candidates to hold a foster care town hall. A really great idea would even to say, bring together a couple independent living groups or group homes where youth are over the age of 18. And especially on the local level, candidates are talking to living rooms of people where there's no more than 10 folks there, right? They want to do that grassroots engagement and talk to folks directly. So whether it's them or their chief of staff or someone on the campaign, that is another really great idea. And third, it's making sure that foster youth are prepared to vote. One of actually the biggest barriers to youth vote, when we talk about youth vote that's ages 18 to 26, is folks just don't have a plan. So you might remember the 2020 election, people might have called you and said, do you know where your voting place is? Do you have your ID? Do you have a plan to get to the poll? Research shows that actually incredibly increases the odds that somebody will actually show up to the polls. That's making sure that they're registered, that's making sure they have ID, and making sure they have a ride. Actually, my first election, when I was in college, my social worker had said they were going to give me a ride, and then they didn't, and then I had to scramble last minute. So we know that happens all the time with youth in foster care. Having access to consistent transportation is incredibly important. And then fourth is, if you can create a flyer, if you can do a presentation to share with organizations in your community that work with foster youth, that should include information on what elections are occurring and when, how those candidates will impact the child welfare system, and information on how to vote. And as you're putting together those presentations, it would not hurt to send an email to the campaign saying that you're going to be doing it and just asking them for a statement on how they will reform the system. So I wanted to share some examples of the slides that we use in our presentations. I'm happy to share these with anyone that wants to reuse them. But in general, we started with voter registration, right? There's two deadlines, and this was in North Carolina. So we said, these are the chances to register, and then how you can register or how you can vote, going in person, going early, or voting at the precinct. And we always said, first time, bring an ID just in case. All municipalities have different rules on IDs, but in general, we suggested that people brought them. And this is very important because sometimes even municipalities have different ways to vote, have early, don't have early. So sharing that information. And then how you can vote by mail, which was a very big issue with COVID. And then if you vote by mail, each state has different things that you need to do. And actually in North Carolina, you have to have a witness sign your envelope. So giving that information so that when that ballot came in, there was no chance it was going to be thrown away or returned. And then ending with making a plan to vote. This was a really important conversation with foster youth, was saying, are you registered? Do you have ID? Do you have a ride? Really harping back to how are you going to get to the poll? So wanted to just open it up if there's any questions, if people just want to drop questions in the chat. So I actually can't see the, let's see, if there is Q&A.
I can
So
read. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yep, Lexi, I was just going to mention and let the participants, attendees know as well. We do have a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, so you can submit questions for Lexi or we have our next group of panelists that we're going to bring up. So we have two options for Q&A. One is that folks can enter a question into the chat, and then Lexi, I see there's already a question there, so you'll have the option to type an answer, and then everyone will be able to read the answer that you've provided. So Lexi, if you don't mind holding the verbal response for the Q&A, we're going to move into the next panel and then bring everybody back on together for Q&A. So I do encourage everyone to either submit your questions through the Q&A function right now, or give yourself a chance to meet our next fabulous group of panelists, and then we'll all come back on together for about 15 minutes at the end to do some Q&A. Thank you, Lexi, for just kind of walking us through both, your personal experience and why this is so important to you, but also giving us those concrete tips of what can we do on the ground? How do we make a difference on a day-to-day level with the young people that we're working with? So I know that I got some great ideas out of that. I hope others did as well. I'm going to move into a panel discussion now to learn about the role that civic engagement plays for young people who have experienced foster care perhaps more recently than you, Lexi, and then the professionals that work with them. So I'm going to invite three panelists to join me on screen. Jamie Lowry is an independent living coordinator with the Montgomery County Office of Children and Youth here in Pennsylvania. She works with mostly 18 to 21-year-olds on independent living skills and getting them ready to be out on their own. As part of her work, she helps youth in her county become more familiar with voting. I'm also going to welcome Brandon Furness, who graduated from the Community College of Allegheny County with his associates in social work. He was in the Allegheny County foster care system from ages 15 to 18 when he signed himself out. Brandon has worked as a youth support partner through High Fidelity Wraparound, and he's currently employed with Family Links as a counselor for foster care youth. And our last panelist, I'll invite her on screen, is Sydney Alfiero. Sydney is a senior at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania. She is majoring in history and minoring in psychology. Sydney is a community advocate and a dedicated member of the Profs program at Kutztown, which is a campus-based support program for students with foster care experience. Welcome to my three panelists. So I'm going to start with a super easy question for our two young people who've experienced foster care. It's kind of a two-part question. Question one, have you ever voted? I hope so, because you're on this panel. And do you remember the first time that you voted? Can you tell us about that? Brandon, would you like to field that first?
Sure. So I have voted. I voted 3 times my whole life. And the first time I voted, I remember I went to my local municipality voting poll location, and it was very confusing. I felt like I didn't know where I was supposed to go. There were luckily people to guide me, show me the directions and how to get to where I need to go to vote. And it's kind of interesting because I didn't know this. They had certain sections where it goes by last name or it goes by address, depending on where you go. So after the first time, I was able to figure it out, and I haven't had problems since.
Great. And same question for you, Sydney. Have you ever voted? And can you tell us about the first time that you did vote?
I've actually voted twice at this point, in the most recent election, and also once when I was, I believe, 21. So that would have been when I first actually came to Kutztown, and was finally like in an area that it would actually be more realistic to walk if I had to the place that I would vote at. It's only about a couple blocks from where I'm at right now. But the only reason I actually ended up voting when I was 21 is because I had a friend who even like went around and did canvassing because she worked for the Hillary campaign. So that was even really the only reason that I did, because she individually, like, it was like part of, something she was very passionate about, to bring awareness to that issue to like her friends and people. And I was just one of those people. And then over the past couple of years, I realized more and more how important it was to vote. And of course, I voted in the most recent election, but it really didn't even seem like something that was even remotely important yet then. And then I didn't have a plan either. I ended up just posting on Facebook, I think, when it came time, because it seemed like I was running out of time. And then somebody actually just was like, yeah, sure, I'll take you, which is great, because there's a really nice sense of community that ends up coming out with, the need to vote amongst college kids. So that's nice, but it's not necessarily the the norm everywhere, unfortunately.
Right. Well, I actually want to key in on something you said. You mentioned that the first time you voted was when you were the age of 21, which actually reminds me of the research that we did leading up to this event. And although we now know that youth in foster care, or all people, are eligible to vote at the age of 18, we saw that big jump, right? So only 40% of youth in foster care were voting at the age, nope, let me rephrase it. They added the questions at 21, but we see an increase in the number of foster youth who vote every year that they collect the data. And so it's interesting that you were able to also mention that your first voting experience came at the age of 21, which was actually 3 years after you were eligible to do so. So we're so glad that you are now voting. That is great. I'm going to move into another question. Were you in foster care at the age you both turned 18? So was your foster care status active at the age of 18? And do you remember if anyone talked to you about your right to vote? So what was the experience of turning 18 like for you when you were if you were in foster care? Brandon, go ahead.
So I was in foster care when I was 18. I signed myself out of the system. I want to say around 4 months after I turned 18. So I had a transition planner through the county who tried to make sure I had everything I needed before signing out, including documentation, a plan to finish high school, stuff like that, where I was going to live and everything. But voting never really came up. A voter ID, how to register for that, it never came up during our conversations before myself signing out. Now, I did have an education liaison who I still have to this day. I'm allowed to have them until I'm 24. And they were the only person who talked to me briefly about voting. And that conversation wasn't very long. It wasn't very detailed. It was just more so, you are eligible to vote. Do you need help with any of it? And I was able to do a lot of it on my own. I got myself registered whenever I was 18. And I want to say that November in 2018 was the first time I voted during the general election. So, and I voted twice since then.
Great. So Sydney, same question to you. Were you in foster care when you turned 18? And do you remember if anyone talked to you about your right to vote?
Yeah, I did age out. I actually moved out physically a little bit before I was 18 because I ended up being allowed to. But I had actually full access to independent living services when I moved out. Unfortunately, though, my independent living caseworker was not very well informed, but that necessarily probably wasn't even her fault. But I honestly really do not remember anyone even saying anything about voting. And if anyone did, I probably would have immediately shut them up by saying something like, nothing ever changes anyways. Because, when you're in foster care, it seems like, 6 months for you is like, that could be a whole other 2 schools and homes, like 4 years of a president, or like, it's just not, it's beyond really your line of sight. Like, you don't really have the, I don't know, like the forethought, because I don't know, you end up kind of a little bit hopeless already about things like that. Because, as Lexi said, a lot of the time, no one really has any plan for you. And that's not great to hear. And, we're not really seeking out this information either, but like, that's kind of what's expected, it's unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I hear you both saying is, in many ways, this might be dependent on the adults who are in your life. Brandon talked about his educational liaison. Sydney talked about her independent living services coordinator. And so what this brings up for me is just the importance of the role that professionals, advocates, or other mentors or caring adults can play in the lives of young people. You each chose to answer that question by actually mentioning adults who are involved in your life. Some do their jobs, fully and thoroughly. Sydney talked about some gaps that she had with her independent living coordinator, but Brandon said he's still receiving services from an education liaison. And so even educating folks who are doing this kind of work, that young people are interested in engaging on these topics. So it's actually a great segue because I want to bring a professional now on screen to answer a question. Jamie, I'm going to ask you, what are the policies about foster care and voting in the child welfare system you work for? So right now we're just going to talk about the policies. What are you instructed to do in the course of your daily job?
So in regards to voting, a couple things. So I think Brandon kind of touched on one. So we have kids. So I strictly work with kids 18 to 21. Some that are on board extensions that remain at 18, some that come back into care after they've left already. But Brandon talked about, having transition plans, and sometimes when our youth leave at 18, they are given a binder of information of all resources, their medical information, their social security card, their birth certificate, and then it also has a section with all the voting information in there. And it is a briefly conversation at that point because they're looking to leave care at that time, but they are given the voter registration saying they're eligible to vote. This is the information, maybe how to fill it out. And then at that time, they still are eligible to have a life skills counselor to continue working with them after they even leave care. So a lot of times those workers that work with those youth will work with them to fill out the voter registration, will take them to vote. We did have a life skills counselor this past election take a few of his youth to the polls to show them how to do it, the whole process. So we do have that. And then we are talking about, I guess, a policy possibly, but we give stipends to our youth that are 18 to 21 for all different kinds of things. We've actually talked about giving a stipend for the youth that register to vote. Just a little incentive for them to do that. And then also a workshop that we use Valley Youth House for our life skills counselors. They do a whole bunch of workshops on different things. So they've also talked about maybe implementing a workshop that will show kids specifically how to register and like all kinds of stuff in regards to registering. So maybe running a workshop to show the youth how to do that.
Wow, those are some great ideas. I love the creativity that's coming out. A stipend for registering to vote, a workshop on how to register to vote. So I applaud your county for the creative approach. Quick follow-up question. Do you know if the voting information in the binder was always included, or is that something that changed in recent years due to advocacy from any particular group?
So as far as me, I've been in this position now for 2 years. And as far as my 2 years that I've been doing this, the voter registration stuff has always been in the binder.
Okay.
So before that, I can't say if they were or when it was really implemented, but for 2 years, it's been in there. Yes.
That's wonderful. Great. Thanks. I'm going to move back to our young adult panelists. We're going to talk a little bit about challenges in accessing voting. And this may or may not apply to you, but I think you were both in campus-based support programs at your colleges for students who've experienced foster care. So your perspective is broad. You may know folks in addition to yourself who've experienced challenges. So the question is, have you ever experienced any challenges in accessing your right to vote? If not, or if you'd like to answer this way, do you think other youth in foster care also experience challenges? So we're talking about challenges in accessing your right to vote. Brandon, do you want to go first?
Sure. So as I said, I voted 3 times and I did go 4 times to vote, but the one time I went, I had troubles actually being able to vote due to not having proper ID there. It wasn't my first time, but they still required it. And because I had just moved, my addresses didn't line up on my ID versus where I was actually living and registered under. So it was just a general election, but they would not let me vote. So that is one of the barriers I ran into while trying to vote. But as far as foster care kids are concerned, I feel like a lot of the biggest barriers are some that Lexi mentioned in her slides, such as having that proper ID, making sure you bring it for your first time, and just additional times too, just to have it. And then also transportation. I know a lot of kids, I didn't get my license until I was 18. I luckily was able to get a car a couple months after, so I had that transportation, but a lot of kids are still taking buses, subways, depending on where they live, and it can be really hard just to figure out where you have to go because there's so many different locations, and finding some reliable transportation to actually get there on time.
Great. And Sydney, same question. Have you ever experienced any challenges in accessing your right to vote, or do you think other youth in foster care experience challenges?
I think one of the main things would be transportation, like Brandon said. The other thing I would say is, well, this might be different for me because I aged out 7 years ago because I'm 25. But when I was in care, there was no real like mandated necessity to access to technology. Like I wasn't like guaranteed a computer or like internet access or anything anywhere I lived. So like, you know, now it seems absolutely unthinkable to not have that. You can just Google whatever you want. And I, you know, really take that for granted now. But there were times in my life where like, if I had a question about like, okay, so where do I vote? I don't even know who I would have asked that. Like, you know, maybe my grandmother potentially, you know, like gotta have a phone to do that. Does anybody pay for your phone bill when you're out of foster care? Nope. All that stuff's dependent on like a lot of your basic survival skills and stuff might be covered. Even then, might not have those, but there are a lot of things that are like, I guess, a little more secondary, like access to technology that are like pretty much basic. And it's something that's everybody is expected to have. And if you don't have that, then it's like, there's so much like you can't look up the bus schedule to see when the bus might show up to pick you up, or if there's even a bus on the route to wherever you need to go to vote. I recall actually registering for the first time to vote when I believe I was 20. And it was only because I was at my cousin's house because I lived with my grandmother and she didn't have internet. So I had to go to my cousin's house in Reading. And how I would do that was like, I would have to go to, I don't even know how I got the bus schedule thing. I think I had one from the bus station, but like I'd have to go through that, take a bus into Reading from Kenhurst, which is like relatively far, and use use the internet at my cousin's house in order to be able to do anything on my computer. So I remember actually like sitting there and like registering to vote and then being like, okay, so it's got to send you a little form also that's like your little voter registration card. But a lot of the time when you move a lot, when you're in foster care, out of foster care, your address ends up changing constantly. And that is something that I had to contend with. And often, even if you do go through all of the proper procedures to change your address, you get like this little card thing that it's never really reprinted on your actual plastic like ID or license. And people don't always really acknowledge it. Like it's a legitimate document, but people always look at you sideways about it. So it's like, even when I actually did vote, I remember somebody looking at me like, what is this thing? Because the little paper that has like your address update on it doesn't have a picture of you or anything. So, you know, it's, if anybody wants to, they can really just give you a hard time about it. Like, and I had no idea that even with like the voter registration stuff and the laws and the accessibility in Georgia changing, I had no idea that it was going to be like that they could make things even more difficult for you like that. Like it just seemed unfathomable that they would even go through even more to try to make things more difficult, because a lot of us have difficulty even having IDs or social security cards, like birth certificates. Like it's not basic or essential for some of us.
Right. Well, I really just want to key in on a few important elements of your answer. And what I'm hearing from both of you is that voting is not a standalone issue, right? It's intricately related to all of these other things. And the two things that I wrote down as you both were talking were transportation and technology, which are immensely important for youth in care, right? So if you don't have a way to get from point A to point B, and if you don't have a way to access information, and having a computer and having a cell phone and having someone to pay your cell phone bill, right? If you're a high school student and you're not working, are you in a stable placement where that cell phone bill is going to get paid every month? And can you access information and technology? I think is an important aspect of keeping young people civically engaged. So thank you both for keying in on that. I'm going to shift over to Jamie and ask a kind of similar but flip-flopped question. So as a caseworker, have you ever experienced any challenges in eliminating barriers for youth on your caseload to vote? And if you haven't personally experienced challenges, do you think other youth in foster care are experiencing challenges?
I think personally for me, I think the challenge would be, and I think maybe Sydney and even Brandon maybe have spoken, I know Sydney has before. I think the challenge is these kids are in foster care for a reason, right? Like they have a lot of other issues going on, a lot of other, like they're trying to maybe get a job and housing. Voting is not like their number one thing, but I feel like for me, if I sit down with my youth that are on my caseload though, and do things with them, they're going to do it. You know what I mean? But if I would tell them like, oh, here's your voter registration thing, like just fill that out, they're not going to do it. So as long as I would do it with them and they then feel supported as well, and not just here you go, and explain things to them and take them and that kind of thing. But it's not going to be number one on their list. So I think the barrier is, they got a lot of other things going on that they feel is more important, which I do get. Some of them are aging out, they have nowhere to go and live. So here you want to talk about voting, can you find me housing first? Like, that kind of thing. But like I said, I've done voting stuff with my kids. So if I sit down with my youth, it's a lot better to do it with them.
Sure. And I love how you're actually transitioning us into our last prepared question of the day. You're thinking about the complexity of life. There are so many different components to living a safe, happy, successful, well-rounded life. And voting is a small part of that, but we want to make it easy and accessible. And so I really like the way you frame it, because it guides me into my last question, which is this, for Sydney and Brandon. Why do you think it is important to vote? Why were you excited to join us on this panel today? And then as you think about why you think it's important to vote, talk to us a little bit about if you always felt this way, even when you were in foster care, or is this something you changed your perspective on as you got a little bit older? So why do you think it's important to vote? Brandon?
So I remember the first time I really considered voting and how important it was. I was 16, and it was during the 2016 presidential election, Trump and Hillary together. And all my friends were talking about it, the impact that it would have. It was one of the biggest elections during my lifetime. And the turnout of it, with how close the election results really were, it made me realize the importance and the potential that just my vote itself could have in that election, along with all of my peers, once we all turned 18 and were eligible to vote. But before then, when I was 14, 15, I really never gave it a second thought. I didn't know what it consisted of. And like Jamie said, I was definitely preoccupied with other things, especially in placement. Like I was working full-time at Pizza Hut. I was still in high school full-time. And on the weekends, I would be able to go home and see my grandmother. And that's all I was really concerned about during that time. Voting wasn't something that really was brought up to me, like I said, until I was 18 and my EL really talked to me about it. But after that, yeah, I used that to my advantage, and I've been voting wherever I can if I'm eligible to. And I think it's really important because it gives youth that opportunity to voice themselves, because the foster care system itself is one of the most controversial systems in politics. And like Lexi was saying, it is political, and that's something that a lot of people don't understand. And I think that youth being able to be made aware of it at an earlier age, and then being able to vote once they turn 18 is super important. And it allows them to have that voice in the world, where mainly voters consist of middle-aged or older adults. So it kind of ratios it out.
Great. And Sydney, of course, same question for you. Why do you think it is important to vote? And do you recall always feeling this way?
So now I definitely believe that it's important to vote, because it is important to believe that you can affect positive change and to be able to look forward to the future. When I was in foster care, or really my entire life, it just seemed like nothing really ever changed. And I didn't have a lot of hope for the future. And I don't want to speak for everybody in the system of foster care, but like I was pretty helpless, and just the idea of like of voting it just didn't make any sense. Like it was like, I remember reading something before, I forget who said it, but it was like, voting doesn't make a difference. If it did, they wouldn't let us, or something like that. And that always really resonated with me when I was younger, because it seemed like, well, I have fallen through the cracks in the system myself, you know, for people just forgetting to file some paperwork. So why do I believe that my like vote is going to get anywhere? Like, why would I believe that like I could, you know, all the time that I'm going to have to take out of my schedule and all of the stress and the extra, you know, whatever for it. Like, it's just, it doesn't seem like it's worth it. It doesn't proportionately, it doesn't seem like it's actually going to affect your life in any meaningful way. But as an adult, I understand how these things work a little bit better now. And had I understood it more then, I might have maybe cared about it more. But I think honestly, more than anything, it was the fact that, like, I mean, like we said, the basic needs being covered, like, until you feel safe, everything else is difficult to worry about. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you don't have your basic things covered, it's difficult to worry about the future. And the future is, you know, politics and like where you are going to be placed in life in a greater, you know, in the greater scheme of things, and understanding that there is a bigger world and that there is more perspective to be had. Because when you're a foster kid, your perspective is pretty small, at least it was for me. No, not really beyond the city or the town or the county, specifically the county a lot of the time that you live in. Like that's your world. That's the world you have. All you really want is out. You want freedom. You want to be safe. You want to be able to take care of yourself, because no matter what, you can take better care of yourself than the crack job that everybody else has done. And that's all you care about. And then a lot of us don't end up going to college. A lot of us end up in prison. A lot of us end up having kids that end up in foster care too. And that's part of because we don't really have a lot of our issues ever addressed. We don't ever get the help that we need. We don't ever really get the time to really actually worry about where we might fit in, other than just surviving and being alive. So other than just, you know, generally increasing awareness, you know, there's still a lot of issues and a lot left to be desired in the political handling of the system. And if they want to get the vote of foster kids, they need to start seeing us as more of an actual issue. And I think beginning, even if foster kids don't necessarily understand how important it is when we're younger, increasing the awareness still kind of increases the pressure. Like Lexi said, like, it's important now. Like, you have to believe that we have the ability to do something. We have the ability to, you know, affect whether or not somebody can be elected, and that we're like still like a political force to be reckoned with, because we are so greatly affected by it too.
Absolutely. I actually love how you tied it all together, because when you step back from it, perhaps when you're aged out of the foster care system, you see how impactful and important all of these things are. But I also love that you're zeroing in on the survival instinct, and you're bringing up really real things. And I love how you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And again, we're talking about, you know, is voting perhaps the most important thing that is happening to you in the year that you turn 18? No, but is it still important? Yes, absolutely. Right. And so if we holistically approach our work and our support, and we build communities that really value young people in foster care and those with foster care experience, we're more likely to develop a generation of people who care about civic engagement. It is 12:53, and we want to let our participants conclude at 1 o'clock. So I'm going to conclude this section of the formal Q&A and just say thank you to the three panelists. And I do want to actually let our attendees know that Lexi had to hop off with her busy schedule, and she is moving on to other things. But I want to let everyone know that we do have a Q&A section going at the bottom of your screen, and 3 questions have actually already been answered. So you can see some of Lexi's responses that she's already provided. And I think what I'm going to do with the last 6 minutes of our day is just ask 2 of these questions to our panelists. Jamie, I'll try to get you involved here on one of them. One of them is actually just a really simple question. Erin Blair asks, I'm interested to know if Brandon and Sydney had any civic engagement education in high school or college. So if you both wouldn't mind answering that question. Have you ever had any formal civic engagement education?
So I did not. I went to a public high school, and we didn't really have any expensive or expansive different education programs like that to be offered to the kids there. And I believe in CCAC in college, whenever I went to college, we did have those kind of opportunities, but by that point I was already more so aware of certain civil engineering, and I was already involved in the social work program. So I kind of had that education behind me already. But as far as high school was concerned, no, I did not.
Okay. Sydney?
Absolutely not. I actually had to Google what that meant. I mean, I understand the definition of the words individually, but like, yeah, like how Brandon said, it's just not something that it was like we had particular educational plans rolled out like that. Because also, one of the main things to take into consideration in foster care is that you move constantly, and a lot of the time that involves moving different school districts. So I personally, when I graduated, and even in college now, like I didn't know how to write an essay. Like I didn't even probably know, you know, the first 20 presidents of the United States, like even though I'm a history major now. Like there was so many gaps in my education that something like civic engagement was, again, just like another far-reaching thing that just wasn't, it just didn't seem like it was within the same realm of understanding and opportunity that we had at the time.
Great, thanks. And then for our final question, I'm actually going to combine two questions that are open in the Q&A. First, Carrie, thank you. Carrie says, this is an amazing panel. Brandon and Sydney, what do you think would be most beneficial in turning out the foster youth vote? How do we encourage getting out the vote? And then Kate says, are foster parents really not educated on how to help you guys transition out of their care? And would this be a beneficial part of their training or expectation? So, and I'm going to give Jamie a chance to answer this as well. So in conclusion, how can foster parents and caseworkers do their part to advance this issue? What are your recommendations?
So mine, I believe how Lexi mentioned, she created a toolbox and she had social media pages open for people to join and spread awareness that way. I believe technology, like Sydney was mentioning also, giving the access to technology and then understanding how to use that technology in order to become more aware of the topic is probably the best way to enlighten foster care youth. And as Jamie said also, the caseworkers, the team members, whoever's working with the youth, actually doing it with them would probably be the most effective way to actually encourage them and help them get signed up at least, because that is step one, is to actually get signed up. And then from there on, you can determine who you want to vote for, get more involved in the different candidates, the different parties. But as long as you're actually registered, I believe that is the most important first step with that. As far as foster care parents are concerned, now my experience with the system was I was in a group home placement, so I don't really know how foster parents are with their foster kids, whether they are trained to teach them those certain things or how that works. So I can't really speak on that one.
Sydney, would you like to field the same question?
So I would say the main thing is workshops. When I was like 16, 17, I had the opportunity to attend a lot of independent living workshops, which unfortunately were a little bit too far away from the house to actually go to them on a regular basis, but I believe that they were offered at least once or twice a week. The main thing, other than them giving you life skills at this, is that they give you money. Because like when I would go to these things, I really didn't care what was going on. I cared that I was getting money. But eventually I started to listen to what they were talking about because it was like, I'm here anyways, may as well. And obviously people need money, anyways. So maybe I think we're really in need of a lot more life skills workshops and just general just workshops for all kinds of things that you might need. Just like general help, like adulting, I guess. Access to technology also, like Brandon said, because like you can't have any of those things without having access to technology. We need to acknowledge that access to technology is basically kind of like a fundamental right at this point, and you need to be able to have access to be able to find out, the things that you're interested in. Otherwise, there's a lot of obstacles and things that you might not even consider, because the internet is basically like your ticket to some other perspective in the rest of the world, and it's like basically like denying somebody access to like going to the public library in a sense. Like you don't tell a kid that that's not okay, because obviously it's a good thing to broaden your perspective and to learn about more things. So we really need to access technology, extremely important, and incentivizing kids properly to want to learn about these things, and then I think everything else kind of falls in place from there.
Amazing. I completely agree. And for young people who've actually experienced it, your voice is the most important voice to listen to. I will give Jamie one more chance to jump in here and just say, what advice do you have for other caseworkers as well to encourage getting out the vote?
Well, I was just going to say one thing too. So I work in Montgomery County here, and all our youth, we try to at 14 to get their state IDs. So hopefully once they're 14, they get their state IDs. Some of them get their license. So a lot of them do have their IDs to be able to go and do that. And I saw one of the questions, I think in regards to having addresses, and I think maybe Sydney might have said something, or Brandon, in regards to moving all the time. And I unfortunately don't have an answer for that, because that is something that we struggle with too, as our kids do move often. But a lot of our kids do at least have state IDs once they turn 14. Computer-wise, all our 18 to 21-year-olds, mostly the majority of them are in college or in high school. They are given computers through our discretionary funds, that they all have computers or laptops, I guess I could say. So they're given laptops through our discretionary funds. That way, they're going off to college. And then all our independent living homes have computers in the home. If for some reason they don't, or it's broken, or they didn't pay their phone bill or something like that, there's computers in all of those homes at this point. And I would just recommend too, really doing the voters registration with the youth. I think that's the best way you're going to get them to get it done. I feel like if you're just going to hand it to them, like I said, they got more important things to do than to fill out a voter registration form. But if you do it, like I said, transportation for us is, we will take them. Their independent living home where they're living at, there's case managers there. They take the kids as well. Their life skills worker can also take them. So there is a lot of options for our kids to get transportation at this point. So I just think they're doing it with them is absolutely the best option to get them to complete this voters registration paperwork.
Thank you all so much for not just sharing your perspective, but giving us concrete ideas. I actually learned a lot in this webinar about things that we can do differently starting tomorrow. So I just want to say thank you for bringing these ideas to the forefront and hopefully sparking some creativity for others as well. I see Kara is back on, so I'm going to turn it over to her to wrap it up.
I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists, Sarah, for leading us in such an important and engaging discussion. Jamie, thank you so much for sharing really some very concrete ideas for caseworkers. And I would say, as a child advocate attorney myself, really anyone involved in the child welfare system, to take upon themselves as part of our mission with young people. And most importantly, I want to thank Brandon, Sydney, and Lexi for being so candid and thoughtful in discussing your own experiences in foster care and your work now to help not only empower young people who are in care as you were, but also to really reform the system through your civic engagement. We are deeply, deeply grateful for you sharing those experiences. And I, for one, am looking forward to seeing all that you will be doing in the next couple of years to help make this a better system for children and families. Thank you all for joining us. The video recording of this webinar will be available. We will follow up by email with any of the resources that we've talked about today. And if you have anything else that you'd like to know about the Field Center, please reach out to our website, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall for our fall symposium.